Okay, so in the election of 1892, we see a replay of 1888, just with the populace thrown in for a bit of variety. It's Cleveland versus Harrison again, but this time Cleveland wins. And upon taking office, he's confronted with a major crisis pretty much right off the bat. It is an economic collapse, and that starts in the railroad industry and it spreads outward. In February of 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading railroad companies failed, and in response to that failure, leading London investment banks in 1890, British investors had sold millions of dollars worth of stock in American railroads and converted their dollars into gold, which had drained the federal gold reserves. The fact that Harrison's paying out these lavish veterans benefits, the tariff, the actual money that we're getting from these high tariffs, is decreasing. You have the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which is requiring the government to buy so much silver. And all of this is draining the gold reserves and essentially leads to a giant economic collapse. In January of 1892 and March of 1893, when Cleveland takes office, the gold reserves are down sharply to about $100 million, which is really low for the time, or at least they believe it's really low. The ones who saw the gold standard as the only evidence of government financial stability are conceivably alarmed by this trend. And the collapse of the railroad triggers a financial panic called the Panic of 1893. Investors begin converting their stock holdings to gold, prices fall, gold reserves sink even further. You see 74 railroads, along with thousands of commercial institutions and hundreds of banks failing. And the panic starts a full-scale depression, which lasts for 4 years. The depression itself also had a very heavy human toll. Unemployment soars to 20 to 25%. Recent immigrants are facing disaster, and the jobless are basically becoming drifters, just roaming around trying to find work. You also have unusually harsh winters, which makes matters worse. Local relief agencies are swamped. Rural America is hit really hard by declining agricultural prices. Basically, it's just a dismal time in the country. You also have some desperate Americans turning to strikes or to protest as a result of this. The Pullman strike, which we read about in chapter 18, is occurring during this time. And all of this unrest is starting to become really worrisome for the middle class, the American middle class, and they're really scared about all this as well. It's also becoming quite obvious that business interests are the prevailing authority, the guiding hand in government policy at this point as well. Eventually, you get to a point where Cleveland actually asks for help. Cleveland was against trying to offset the depression. He said that boom and bust economic cycles were inevitable. You just had to sort of ride it out. But it eventually gets so bad that he asks for a bailout. And he turns to a very familiar face. He turns to J.P. Morgan and his bankers to lend the government money. They end up lending the government $62 million in exchange for bonds at a special discount. As the battle over the tariff made clear earlier, corporate interests, like I say, are holding the whip hand, and they are the defining voice in American policy at the time. Cleveland's policies also served to split the Democratic Party. Farm leaders and silver Democrats, those who advocated for the coining of silver, began to drift away from him because of his opposition to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. But you also see, as a result of this depression, some reorientating of social thought. The idea of laissez-faire becomes much less popular because it becomes much more obvious that despite their hard work and sober devotion to middle-class values, some people just fall in hard times because of forces outside of their control, and it's not necessarily because they're bad or sinful people. All right, so the Republicans make massive gains in the 1894 midterm elections, which goes to show just how unimpressed the society was with Cleveland and the Democrats following this depression. Serious economic divisions are splitting Americans in the 1890s, and they become focused on the single symbolic issue of silver coinage. The fact that Cleveland was so rigidly wedded to the gold standard forced his opponent to become exaggeratedly obsessed with the coinage of silver. And all this really does is obscure the real issues that are dividing the society. Each side has a good point, though. The gold advocates realized that paper money had to be based on more than just the ability to run a printing press, that inflation would be catastrophic for the economy. And on the other side, the silver advocates knew that extremely tight money policies would depress prices and devastate farmers. However, the communication isn't great. Neither side manages to get this idea across very well. The Democratic Convention completely repudiates Cleveland, though. They adopt silver coinage into their platform, and they nominate a newcomer, William Jennings Bryan, who is a 36-year-old idealistic lawyer, and he's new on the political scene. He makes a very famous speech, and the picture actually kind of depicts, or is a depiction of this idea. He uses Christian imagery with his economic analysis to deliver his convention speech, saying that you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns, and you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, hinting that the gold standard or retention of the gold standard would be detrimental to society. This creates something of a dilemma for the Populist Party. The fact that the Democrats adopt a pro-silver platform, because it didn't really allow them to remain distinct. It was one of their key issues, but they had lots of others that weren't included in the Democratic platform, and so they weren't really sure what to do. The Populists ended up nominating Bryan on a separate ticket, and then swapping the vice presidential candidates, which really just managed to confuse voters more than anything. The Republicans, meanwhile, nominate William McKinley, whose name is on the McKinley Tariff, and their platform embraced high protective tariffs and the gold standard. So in the campaign, Bryan is everywhere at once. He's traveling all across the country by train. He's delivering campaign speeches to hundreds of people and audiences in 29 different states, so he's just everywhere. McKinley's campaign is a lot more calm and dignified, you could say. McKinley pretty much never leaves his house. He stays in Canton, Ohio, and he runs what becomes known as a front porch campaign. He basically just stays there, and the people come to him to listen to him. And it's all very carefully staged and very carefully orchestrated by his campaign manager, a man called Mark Hanna. On election day, McKinley's campaign turns out to be very successful. He wins 600,000 votes more than Bryan, which is a fairly overwhelming mandate. And the Republicans also managed to retain control of Congress. The fact that Bryan lost, despite the Depression and the protest spirit and everything, can largely be attributed to the limitations of his own constituency. While most of them were passionately loyal, there weren't a whole lot of them. They were still a relatively small number. Democrats upheld a platform and candidate with very little appeal for factory workers, for the urban middle class, for the settled family farmers on the Midwestern Corn Belt, and because of that lack of a voting bloc, he ultimately suffered in the polls. The McKinley administration very quickly translates its conservative platform into law. They pushed for tariff rates to go up to an all-time high. The Currency Act officially committed the United States to the gold standard. And with returning prosperity in 1897, everything appears to be rosy, at least. All right, turning our attention now to American expansionism. So from the very first European settlers, Americans have always been expansionist. And in the 1840s, this acquired a name. It was Manifest Destiny, the idea that we were going to stretch across the continent. By the time we get to the 1880s, though, there's no continent left to stretch across. And so the idea is extended outward. And it becomes manifested in the idea of collecting colonies, that national greatness demanded an empire, an overseas empire. And there were various advocates for this, and they advocated it for various reasons. Businessmen, business leaders believed that continued domestic prosperity required overseas markets. That as American industrial capacity expands, foreign markets offer a kind of safety valve for the pressures that are building up in the U.S. economy. Advocates for a stronger navy also fueled this expansionist idea. Alfred Thayer Mahan publishes in 1890 The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and he equates sea power with national greatness, and so urges the U.S. to build up its navy. Part of this is a requirement for overseas bases and fueling stations, and especially in the Pacific Islands. And so that, of course, requires acquiring territories. Religious leaders also fuel this expansionist zeal because they say it's America's mission to spread Christianity. This idea often took on something of a racist tinge. The idea that they were Christianizing and civilizing the world's weaker races. A group of Republican expansionists that included Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt preached imperial greatness and military might, built upon the idea of social Darwinism. They argued that war was a vehicle for natural selection and would test American manhood. Through doing this, you would be able to restore chivalry and generally create a new generation of civic-minded Americans. Following this, we also have a series of diplomatic skirmishes that the United States gets involved in between the U.S. and Great Britain. And this begins to reawaken Americans' latent sort of anti-British feeling. The big one happened in Colombia. In Latin America, in Colombia, there is a conflict, a boundary dispute between, Venezuela, between Venezuela and British Guiana in 1895. The disagreement gets worse when gold is found in that contested territory. The U.S. pipes up and offers to arbitrate the discussion, and the British reject that outright. They're like, this isn't important, and or you aren't important. And they also knocked this idea, the Monroe Doctrine, which had been in effect for quite some time. But the British say that it has no standing in international law, and the U.S. has no right to intervene in this conflict. This angers Grover Cleveland, who's in office at the time, and so he goes ahead and asks Congress to set up a commission to settle the dispute anyways. The commission ultimately rules in Venezuela's favor, and they do so without British approval. Ultimately, because the British didn't really want to enter into a war with America at the time, and it started to become a very real possibility, they submitted to the arbitration, and eventually all the disputed territory was awarded to Britain anyways, and so it helped improve our relations with them. But it was kind of our first foray into this imperialistic new attitude. I have here a picture depicting that conflict with Great Britain. Here you see President Grover Cleveland twisting the lion's tail, the lion being a representative of the British government. He's standing on an island labeled Great Britain as well. And you have back behind him sort of cheering crowds representing Americans. Cleveland actually won quite a reputation for standing up to the lion, as it were. So meanwhile, while the interesting things are going on in Venezuela, you also have the U.S. Navy focusing on the Samoan Islands in the South Pacific, where it's trying to access a port as a refueling station. There are other rivals in the Samoan Island, and eventually negotiations begin, and the U.S. ends up sharing the islands with Great Britain and Germany. By that time, though, attention had started to shift to the Hawaiian Islands. Under an 1887 treaty, the United States built a naval base at Pearl Harbor near Honolulu, and the American economic dominance, as well as the influx of foreigners and the fact that they were kind of taking over the royal court in Hawaii, was beginning to anger Native Hawaiians. And so when the current king, the sitting king in Hawaii, leaves, they welcome a new queen, and she's very nationalist. Her name's Lilikiani, and she's very strong-willed, and she's very hostile to American interests on the Hawaiian Islands. While this is going on in Hawaii, in 1890, the framers of the McKinley Tariff are being pressured by sugar growers to eliminate duty-free status for Hawaiian sugar because it's not considered domestic. And so, after doing that, fast forward to 1893, Hawaii's sugar prices are plummeting, and the planters who were there are mostly American, and they decide that they are going to depose Queen Lilikiani, proclaim an independent nation in Hawaii, and then ask for U.S. annexation so that they can be protected as an industry. This grab for Hawaii was troubling to Cleveland, who's still in office, and so he sent a representative to investigate the situation. And the representative reported that there was some question as to whether the Hawaiian people actually desired annexation, and if it wasn't just American business interests. Cleveland's scruples and his hesitation at annexing Hawaii pretty much infuriated expansionists who really wanted these islands. And so when McKinley won the presidency, and took office in 1897, he really pushed for the acquisition of the Hawaiian Islands. And so in 1898, Congress proclaimed Hawaii an American territory, and then 60 years later, it joined the Union as the 50th state. And you can see in the picture I have here, the picture is from Puck, which is a periodical that was put out at the time, and it tends to be Democratic-leaning. And so you can see some animosity towards the idea of annexing Hawaii here. They picture the annexation as a shotgun wedding with Uncle Sam and a woman who's representing Hawaii being wed more or less against their will, and you have a figure representing McKinley holding the shotgun in the background.